The soft light of the evening lamps fell on the table, illuminating the faces of the three people sitting at dinner. Alice looked down at her plate, pretending to listen intently to her husband. Mark was telling another story from his work, with the ease that was characteristic of him. She looked up at her husband, smiled, but her thoughts were completely absorbed by someone else. With each new word Mark spoke, Alice lost touch with reality, more and more. Her gaze shifted for a moment to Jackson, who was sitting across from her. They exchanged a brief but very intense glance, one that said more than words could. Her face remained calm, but conflicting feelings were bubbling up inside her: delight, shame, curiosity, and danger. Jackson nodded slightly and looked away, but for Alice, this fleeting gesture was of great significance. He felt the same way. This simple realization made her heart beat faster. It seemed like a secret dance in which no one but the two of them could participate. After a few minutes, Mark got distracted and got up from the table to go out for another bottle of wine. The moment he left the room, the tension in the room became almost palpable. Alice and Jackson were left alone, each pretending that dinner was more important than their secret thoughts. "Thanks for coming, Jackson," Alice whispered, not even looking at him. He smiled slightly, and his eyes rested on her face for a moment, studying her like an artist looking at an unfinished canvas. "I'm always happy to spend time in your company," he replied, keeping his voice low so that the sound didn't echo out of the room. His words penetrated her mind like the rustling of leaves, hidden from the rest of the world. They exchanged a brief but incredibly deep glance. At that moment, Alice felt something dangerous, something that was forbidden and yet irresistible. Mark's footsteps sounded in the hallway. He was coming back. Alice and Jackson instantly looked away from each other, each trying to regain their normal, everyday expressions. "You're both quiet tonight," Mark said as he refilled their glasses. He sounded cheerful, unaware of the tension simmering around him. "Just enjoying the company," Jackson replied, taking a sip of wine and looking at his friend. His face was impeccably calm, as if nothing out of the ordinary was happening. Alice faked a light laugh, but inside her heart was sinking. She felt that this was only the first scene of a dangerous game they had unwittingly started. In a small town where everyone knew each other and was always interested in the lives of their neighbors, Mark and Jackson were almost local legends. They grew up together on quiet streets, sharing childhood secrets and dreams that gradually became clear only to the two of them. Their paths never diverged. From school to college and then into adulthood, they walked together like brothers united not by blood, but by years of shared experiences. After Mark married Alice, their friendship did not weaken. On the contrary, Jackson often became a part of their family life. Mark trusted Jackson like himself, having no doubt that his best friend would always be there for him. He repeatedly invited Jackson to family dinners, small parties, or just to get together for a glass of wine. Jackson was that rare person who was considered part of the family, and Mark believed that his wife shared that feeling. For Alice, who had come here to start a new life with Mark, this city was calm but somewhat colorless. Her days went by in a familiar rhythm: work, housework, meetings with her husband, and occasional gatherings with his friends. And although Mark was a good husband, reliable, kind, and willing to help, she felt more and more that her heart longed for something brighter than this predictable routine. Meeting Jackson was the escape she needed. He was not like Mark. There was something alluring and mysterious about him, something that made her heart beat faster. And although Jackson tried to remain discreet, Alice noticed that his gaze lingered on her longer than necessary. Their conversations, which had been polite and almost indifferent at first, eventually became filled with hints, indirect questions, and half smiles that left a slight taste of the forbidden. One day, when Mark left them alone, Alice and Jackson found themselves on the veranda of the house together, watching the sun slowly sinking behind the horizon. "Have you ever thought about how strange life is?" Jackson asked quietly, looking off into the distance, as if searching for an answer on the horizon. "I think it's a common thought for anyone who decides to start a new life," Alice answered cautiously, trying not to look him directly in the eye. Silence reigned between them, but it was a silence filled with meaning, a silence in which each of them knew that the other felt the same way. Days passed, but the tension between Alice and Jackson only grew. They tried to hide their feelings by keeping their distance when they met together. However, every time their eyes met, or they were alone, the atmosphere became even more electrifying. One evening, Mark invited Jackson to dinner to discuss plans for the weekend. As usual, he was trusting of his friend, not noticing how Jackson's presence made Alice nervously move her fingers along the edge of the tablecloth. She threw short glances at him, hiding her emotions behind a mask of politeness. When dinner was over, Mark left for a minute to make a phone call to one of his clients, leaving the two of them in the cozy room, lit by soft candlelight. Alice looked down, not knowing what to say or how to behave. It seemed that any word or gesture could destroy her carefully constructed facade. "I think you're nervous," Jackson said quietly, leaning slightly toward her. She looked up at him, and in Jackson's eyes she saw the same sparkle that had appeared repeatedly during their previous meetings. It wasn't just interest, it was desire, concealing a danger that both attracted and repelled her. "Jackson," Alice whispered, not knowing how to express her feelings. She wanted to push him away and be alone with him at the same time, to give vent to the emotions that were overwhelming her soul. Jackson gently touched her hand, his fingers warm, and his touch slightly trembling. At first glance, this gesture might have seemed quite insignificant, but to Alice it meant much more. It was the line they both dared to cross, the line that separated them from the past. "I can't just sit next to you and pretend this isn't happening," Jackson whispered. His voice was soft, but full of determination. "Every time I see you, it only confirms to me that I can't forget you." Alice remained silent, feeling her heart ready to leap out of her chest. She realized that this moment could change their lives forever, and the fear of the consequences was superimposed on an exciting desire to let go. Their closeness was palpable, and only a few centimeters separated their faces. Alice looked at Jackson, studying his features as if trying to memorize every detail. Her hand was trembling, but she did not move away, as if captivated by his magnetic gaze. Suddenly, the door opened, and Mark walked into the room with a big smile on his face, completely unaware of what had just happened. Jackson and Alice instantly recoiled from each other, trying to regain their normal appearance. "I decided to take the weekend off, as we planned," Mark said happily, not noticing the strange tension between them. "Alice, Jackson, and I can go fishing and then join you for a picnic. What do you say?" "Sounds great," she replied quietly, trying to smile, though her thoughts remained captive to her recent intimacy with Jackson. It seemed that this innocent moment on the verge of a kiss had changed everything. "You look happy with Mark," he said, but there was something in his voice that made Alice hold her breath for a moment. "Yes, Mark is a wonderful man," she replied, a little muffled, as if she were convincing herself of that. "It's just, sometimes I feel like I'm missing something." Jackson remained silent, but his eyes were eloquent enough. He felt the same emptiness, the same dissatisfaction that filled them both. Each encounter only added fuel to the fire they had been carefully hiding, and although Mark suspected nothing, Alice knew it was approaching a point that would be impossible to ignore. The following days were a blur for Alice. She tried to keep herself busy with household chores, work, and meet up with friends, but her thoughts kept returning to the moment when she and Jackson were within breathing distance of each other. Her mind condemned her, reminding her of her marital fidelity, but her heart, mad and restless, continued to crave the forbidden. Mark knew nothing of the torment that tormented his wife. He was friendly and kind as always, discussing weekend plans with her and doing his best to make their life together seem perfect. But even his care could not drown out the inexplicable emptiness that was gradually filling up with images of Jackson. Alice tried to avoid him, but fate seemed to be playing tricks on her, continuing to create opportunities for their chance meetings. Each such meeting only increased her internal conflict. One morning, when Mark was away on business, Jackson appeared on her doorstep. Alice was standing on the veranda, watching the garden, when she saw his figure approaching down the path. A feeling of panic and excitement simultaneously filled her as he came closer. "Alice, we need to talk," he said, stopping in front of her. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself, but his presence here, when they were alone, destroyed all her intentions of keeping her distance. "We shouldn't do this, Jackson," she whispered, looking away. But as if he hadn't heard her words, he stepped closer, his hand gently touching her shoulder. "I can't stop thinking about you, Alice," he whispered, and she saw real suffering in his eyes. "I know it's wrong, but every minute without you is unbearable." Alice felt herself dissolving in his words. Her mind screamed that this had to stop, but her heart said otherwise. She slowly raised her gaze, looking directly into his eyes, and realized that they were both at the point where there was no going back. "Jackson, Her voice trembled, but she didn't have time to finish. Jackson gently embraced her, and their lips met in a kiss that seemed both forbidden and irresistible. She felt all the tension that had built up over the past weeks evaporate in that moment. The kiss contained everything she had been hiding for so long: passion, doubt, fear, and desire. It lasted only a few seconds, but for them, this moment stretched into eternity. When they stepped away from each other, there was a mixture of despair and satisfaction in their eyes. "We shouldn't have done this," Alice whispered, regaining control of her voice. "It's a mistake, Jackson." "Maybe," he agreed, but his gaze remained firm. They stood in silence, realizing that those words and that kiss had changed everything. Alice knew that from now on she would have to live with the consequences of her choice, and that this choice could destroy not only her life, but Mark's as well. Jackson gradually became more and more obsessed with Alice. He could not accept the fact that after their secret meetings, she returned to her husband Mark, continuing to lead a normal married life. His desire to be with her turned into a painful need that increasingly clouded his mind. One day, during their secret meeting, Jackson couldn't help himself. His voice took on a dangerous, cold tone that Alice had never heard before. "You have to leave him, Alice," he said, looking her in the eye with an insistence that made her shiver. "We can't go on as if nothing has happened. You belong to me, not him." Alice shuddered at his words. She could feel the fear gripping her. She had always seen Jackson as a man who gave her the freedom and passion that was missing in her life, but now he was starting to scare her. "Jackson, we can't just ruin Mark's life," she whispered, trying to find a rational explanation and reassure him. "I can't do this to him." But Jackson wasn't listening. His eyes burned with jealousy and anger, and he moved even closer to her, a slight tinge of aggression in his movements. "I don't care what happens to him," he hissed. "I've waited too long for you, and now you can't just run away. If you leave me, Alice, there will be consequences. I won't let anyone take you away." Her heart fluttered. For the first time, she saw Jackson as not only a lover, but a threat. He was willing to do anything to have her by his side, and his obsession became frightening to her. Now their relationship no longer seemed like an embodiment of passion or freedom. It was turning into a trap from which she did not know how to escape. Over the next few days, Jackson continued to pressure her. He whispered threats to her in moments when they were alone, and his messages became increasingly demanding and aggressive. He even showed up at her house at night, making Alice feel like she was under constant surveillance. Every time she tried to get away from him, his obsession only intensified. Alice felt trapped with no way out. Jackson threatened that if she did not leave Mark, he would find a way to eliminate him from their lives. His words sounded frightening and cruel, and she began to realize that she was in a dangerous situation where even her life could be at risk. She tried to distance herself from Jackson, to avoid him, but he followed her everywhere, like a shadow that never disappears. Alice realized that now their relationship had become a death trap for her, and her every move could lead to irreparable tragedy. Alice and Jackson met again in the woods in secret. Night had fallen on the small forest, enveloping it in silence and darkness. Under the light of the full moon, which was breaking through the branches of the trees, Jackson and Alice stood in a remote forest clearing where no one could see or hear them. "Why can't you do this, Alice?" he asked, his voice hard and tense. "You said you love me, so what's stopping you?" "Jackson, please understand," she replied, keeping her distance and keeping calm with an effort of will. "I can't just go and ruin Mark's life. It wouldn't be fair. and it wouldn't be fair. Jackson clenched his fists and his face darkened with anger. Unfair? Cruel? He snapped. What about me? I'm standing here, ready to give up everything for you, and you're just afraid to take a step. How can you do this to me? Alice felt afraid. He didn't look like the Jackson she had known before. His eyes were full of pain and anger, and she realized that there was no room for common sense in his obsession. I can't. I just can't, she whispered, stepping back. Jackson, this has gone too far. I need to think. I need to do this alone. But her words only fueled his anger. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them, and she felt fear grip her even more. You think you can just leave me, after everything we've been through together? His voice sounded dangerous, and she realized there was nowhere else to go. Her heart was racing, but she tried to stay calm. Jackson, please, she whispered, trying to calm him down. But at that moment his patience broke down. In a fit of jealousy and anger, he pushed her harder than he could have realized. Alice lost her balance, her legs buckled, and she flew backwards, falling on the stones that protruded from the ground. It all happened in an instant. Jackson stood there, stunned, his heart sinking as he saw her lying motionless on the ground. Her face was pale in the moonlight, and her eyes remained closed. Alice, he whispered, taking a few hesitant steps toward her body. His hands trembled, and fear flooded his mind. He sat down next to her, touched her arm, hoping she'd only fainted. But there was no breathing. She was motionless. Jackson felt panic grip him. He didn't want this to happen. He didn't want it to end like this. His mind began to frantically search for a way out, an excuse that would allow him to escape this horrible situation. He looked at the dark clearing around him, at the traces he could have left. Suddenly a thought occurred to him. If she was found here, in a remote part of the forest, it would look like an accident. Perhaps she had fallen by accident. He hoped that people would just believe that. There was no other way out. Rising to his feet, Jackson stepped back, examining her motionless body once more, and horrified, turned and hurriedly walked back into the darkness of the forest, leaving Alice there on the cold ground, hoping that his traces would disappear with the night. The next morning, the local police were notified of a gruesome discovery in the forest. Alice's body was discovered by a local hunter who stumbled upon her by accident when he saw her motionless body among the rocks. Detectives immediately arrived at the scene and began investigating. Detective Henry, an experienced investigator with many years of experience, examined the scene with an eye for the smallest detail. At first glance, it really looked like an accident. Alice could have lost her balance and fallen on the rocks. However, a few little things caught his attention. Look at this area, he said to his young partner. Something doesn't add up. It's lying here at an acute angle, and some of the scratches on the ground indicate that it didn't just fall by accident. His partner nodded, trying to understand what the detective was pointing out. They examined Alice's body and found several signs of a struggle. Scratches on her arms and bruises on her wrists. It didn't look like an ordinary accident anymore. Meanwhile, Jackson, upon learning of the discovery, tried to look shocked and sad so as not to arouse suspicion. He closely followed the developments, but the tension did not leave him. Every detail could give him away. The night the police began their investigation, Jackson realized that his plan to hide the truth might fail. The next day, Detective Henry arrived at Mark's house to learn more about Alice's life and surroundings. He realized that in order to solve the case, he needed to find out about her relationships with her family. Mr. Mark, I'm sorry to have to ask you these questions at a difficult time, but I need to know more about your wife, Henry began, noticing Mark sitting dejectedly in the living room. Mark looked absolutely shattered. He had no idea that Alice had any problems in her life, so the news of her death came as a real blow to him. Alice and I were happy, Mark replied, barely able to find the words. We had no problems. She was a wonderful wife. I can't even imagine what could have led to this. But the detective knew that there could be something more behind any perfect relationship. He decided to talk to the family's friends as well to learn more about their surroundings. And that's when Jackson's name came up in conversations as Mark's closest friend and a frequent guest at their home. Henry decided to talk to Jackson. He behaved cautiously, trying not to draw too much attention to himself. He answered the questions with restraint, showing his deep regret and grief over the loss of Alice. "It's terrible," he said when Henry asked him about his relationship with Alice and Mark. "She was a wonderful woman, and I was just a friend to them. This is all so sudden." But the detective felt that Jackson was hiding something. His answers were overly elaborate, and his eyes avoided direct contact. Suspicions grew, and Henry decided to turn to technical expertise and examine the physical evidence in detail. Subsequently, the forensic scientist reported an important detail. Pressure marks were found on Alice's hands, indicating that she could have been held by the wrists before the fall. This discovery was an important piece of evidence, and now the detectives realized that Alice's death was no accident. Henry once again reviewed all the testimony and paid attention to Jackson's behavior. His constant presence at Mark's house, his close relationship with Alice, which now seemed suspicious, and his not-so-natural reaction to Alice's death led the detective to a new line of inquiry. All the small details that Henry had noticed came together to form a single picture. Jackson could have been involved in Alice's death, and now the detective was ready to go further to uncover this dark secret that was hiding under the guise of friendship and close relationships. Detective Henry had gathered enough suspicious facts to launch a more detailed investigation into Jackson. He decided to call him in for a second interview, this time asking more direct questions and leaving no room for evasion. Jackson, visibly nervous, showed up at the police station, where he was met by Henry with official restraint. The first few minutes of the interrogation were formal, until the detective turned to specific questions. "Mr. Jackson, you said you were a close friend of Mark and his wife," Henry began, watching Jackson's reaction. "But some of your actions raise questions for us. For example, your behavior after her death, as well as some of the testimony we've received from neighbors. People noticed that you visited Alice often, even when Mark was away." Jackson tensed, his face losing its former confidence. He could barely contain himself, trying to keep his cool, but his hands betrayed his nervousness as they trembled slightly. We were just friends," he said, trying not to meet Henry's gaze. "Maybe people got the wrong idea. I just liked spending time with them." "Well, it's strange to hear that answer, considering that there were signs of a struggle at the scene, as well as marks on Alice's wrists that suggest someone was holding her before she fell," the detective said, watching Jackson's face closely. Jackson remained silent, and his tension became more and more noticeable. Drops of sweat appeared on his forehead, and his breathing became more labored. He could no longer hide the fear that was gripping him from the inside. Henry saw this, and realized he was close to the truth. "Maybe you can explain to us what exactly happened that night," the detective continued, keeping his tone calm but insistent. "You were there, weren't you? You met her in the woods." Jackson felt that he could no longer avoid answering. His shoulders slumped, and he seemed to suddenly surrender under the pressure. He realized that his secret was out, and now there was only one thing left to do: try to justify himself. "I didn't mean to kill her," he whispered, his voice sounding broken. "It was an accident. She refused to leave Mark. We argued, and I was blinded by anger and jealousy. I didn't mean to hurt her." "You pushed her, and that led to her death," Henry concluded, leaving no room for excuses. "You knew what you had done, and you tried to hide it." Jackson sighed, his face reflecting deep regret and despair. He could no longer deny the obvious. "I was afraid," he admitted, looking at the floor. "I was afraid that I would be blamed for her death. She didn't deserve that. This whole thing didn't go the way I planned." Henry listened to his confession in silence. He saw before him an unhappy man whose obsession and jealousy had led to the tragedy. Alice was the victim of what began as a secret affair and ended in death. After the interrogation, Jackson was detained. The investigation had enough evidence to bring him to justice for Alice's murder. In the end, he pleaded guilty and signed a confession describing what happened that fateful night. Jackson's trial became a real sensation in the small town. Every resident followed the events closely, and people's reactions were vigorous and unequivocal. By this time, everyone knew Jackson as a reliable and friendly man, a loyal friend of Mark's. He was part of the community, participated in local events, and was always ready to help whenever needed. But after the details of the crime came to light, people saw him in a completely different light, as a ruthless traitor and murderer. The trial at which Jackson was brought to justice for Alice's murder was tense and deeply emotional. Jackson's testimony and the evidence collected by the detectives created a complete picture of the tragedy that unfolded before the eyes of the audience. Mark sat in the front row, watching every word, every movement of his former friend. His face remained stony, as if he had hardened himself against any emotion, but a storm was raging inside him. Year after year, he trusted Jackson, considered him part of his family, and now Mark couldn't believe that this trust had been betrayed in the most brutal way. As the judge read out the charges and the evidence that proved Jackson's guilt, Mark felt his world crumble. Every word about the betrayal, every fact about what happened in the forest, broke his heart even more. Jackson's speech, in which he tried to justify his actions with jealousy and obsession, only increased Mark's pain and anger. He looked at Jackson and saw not a friend, but a stranger who had destroyed everything that was important to him. When Jackson addressed the court with the last word, he pleaded guilty, admitting that his actions were motivated by jealousy and painful feelings for Alice. He apologized to everyone he had hurt, including Mark, but these words rang hollow. For Mark, there was no apology that could compensate for this betrayal and pain. When the judge announced the verdict, sentencing Jackson to 15 years in prison, Mark felt a brief, cold moment of satisfaction. Justice had been served, but at the same time, he realized that no sentence would bring him back his wife or peace of mind. As the judge read the charges, the courtroom was filled with people who could not believe Jackson's cruelty. Whispers, muffled shouts, and sometimes suppressed tears echoed through the room. People recalled how they had recently met Alice, talked to her, and seen what a sincere and friendly person she was. Now it seemed to them that all of Jackson's familiar features were just a mask, hiding a real monster. After the verdict was announced, people left the hall with heavy hearts, not hiding their indignation. Loud noises and whispers accompanied Jackson as he was taken out of the courtroom. Murderer, traitor, inhuman. These words, spoken quietly in the crowd, echoed his sentence in the eyes of the community. His name was now forever tarnished, and people were horrified to remember that they may have once trusted him, unaware of his true nature. After the trial, Mark slowly left the courtroom. His face remained emotionless, but every step he took was filled with pain and severity of loss. He had lost not only Alice, but also the trust and confidence that had been the foundation of his life. Jackson's life in prison was a real challenge. He found himself in a world where every day reminded him of the terrible mistake that had destroyed not only his life, but the lives of many people. Having lost his freedom and the trust of his community, Jackson faced a new reality where he was no longer perceived as an ordinary man or a good friend. He became someone who was considered a traitor, a murderer whose obsession and jealousy led to tragedy. Time passed, but prison life did not bring Jackson any relief. He remained lonely, trapped in a corner of his own thoughts and memories. The years dragged on slowly, reminding him that his freedom had been lost forever, not only physically, but spiritually as well. This is how the story ended, leaving behind pain and destruction. As Henry returned to his office, he felt the weight of the case. He knew that the truth had been found, but he also realized that sometimes jealousy and obsession can turn into a death trap, destroying the lives of all those caught up in this chain of deceit and betrayal.